back. It is often said, right here, that we know so little about our history, even our recent history, even the history of the last century. And 24 hours a day, those who would have us see history through their eyes and their mind control programming are constantly online eradicating, changing, adjusting, and rewriting history, in quotes, as we are supposed to know it. Frank Joseph, one of the great researchers I've ever known, has a string of books out about our ancient past. He's come across something that he told me about, and I asked him if he'd present it on the program. I had no idea. I haven't come across this. Apparently, it was considered top secret and declassified at some point. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to let Frank do that. Hello, Frank. Welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Hello, Jeff. Thank you so much. It was a very excellent introduction tonight, and I just underscore every word you said.
Very good. I just tell it like I feel it, you know? It's the way to do it.
Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss this. I just came across this piece of information, which seems kind of funny on its surface, but was not funny when it was happening. Are we still together here? You still hear me?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Fine.
I've been hearing some clicks on this, and I guess it's okay.
That's London, Tel Aviv.
No. Yeah, maybe
Berlin.
they're taking special interest tonight. Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's a strange thing. It's unknown. It's virtually totally unknown in this country. It's known a little bit in England and in Canada, but not very well known here, even though this secret, and it was stamped top secret by our U.S. government, was disclosed in 1974. But in any case, I found this, and I'm talking about this because it's not just a unique and strange part of history, but I think there are some lessons to be learned from it, and there are some parallels with what's going on now, because it's kind of an internal thing. Well, basically, it's this. The United States came very close. I mean, we're talking don't know exactly how much time, but at least within a year of having a full-blown war with the British Empire, and that included our invasion of Canada. This was not just a military pipe dream. It involved literally tens of thousands of men, involved millions of dollars worth of production geared up, and this was in the middle of the Depression. So this shows you how serious this was. This was not just a contingency program. Every country has contingency programs. What if this? What if that? That's all on paper. This was not on paper. This was actual men, the boots on the ground, weapons manned.
Wow.
And this is on mostly on the American and the Canadian side, although the British were very coy about it. And I won't go through the whole thing, but I'm writing up an article at this point for a magazine that I enjoy writing for. It's called the Barnes Review. It's about the only magazine I can imagine I could write this up for, and that'll be out in a couple of months. But this story really begins in World War I. I'll be as succinct as I possibly can. If I'm going on too long, please rush me along. But this story begins in World War I. During World War I, the British were absolutely convinced in 1914 that the war would be over just a few months and all the boys would be home by Christmas. Well,
Frank, excuse me, but
yeah.
I hear that. Do you think they really believe that? They have a military-industrial
They absolutely believed it.
They did. They really did.
Yeah, they absolutely believed it. This was the British Empire, for God's sakes. This was the largest empire the world has ever known.
They could step on Germany like it was a bug. All right.
It'd be nothing. And they had France, the French army, so it's nothing. It was just to knock it over. The French were not quite so confident because they had experience in the War of 1870-71, so they knew this would be a hard fight, but the British did not. I mean, the biggest empire, the biggest navy, just tremendous influence. So they were absolutely confident that within about 5 or 6 months, they'd knock over the whole thing. The boys would be home by Christmas. Well, that didn't happen. And by 1916, just 2 years later, actually a little less than that, but I'd say by 1916, it was crystal clear to the British leaders that they were in a very serious condition because the war was a stalemate, as everybody knows, but the main problem was the British and the French, to say nothing of the Russians, were running low on munitions and all forms of war supplies. Their economies were being drained. The German economy, of course, was very strong before World War I, and it was suffering too, but it was holding up much better. And the economists in England, in London, the London School of Economics, told the British leaders in government, they said that it is physically impossible for us to sustain this level of participation in the war. We must do one of two things. We must either sue for peace right now, cut our losses, because you're going to bankrupt to the entire empire, or else we have to get huge amounts of cash from the United States. So the criminal British leaders, rather than sparing the lives of literally countless millions, hundreds of millions of their fellow countrymen and their allies, rather than sparing their lives, they went hand in hand to the Americans. And the Americans were only too happy to extend all these generous loans. The Americans were fools, too, because they should have known that the British would never be able to repay these loans. Not all of it, anyway. So the Americans, like DuPont and all these other companies, they gave the British and the French everything they needed, all the weapons, the loans, the production, and all that. And, of course, they won the war. Well, the war's over. And then the Americans present the bill to the British. Talk about sticker shock. The British were presented with a bill by the Americans for $22 billion. Now, to put that in perspective, the gross national product of Britain at that time was $26 billion. And the Americans wanted full payment. Well, you're the British Empire. You're claiming to be the biggest and the baddest and the best. We want that now. And the British said, if we give you that will bankrupt not only our country, but the whole empire will collapse. Well, go to your allies then. They owe you money too, the French, the Italians, and the Russians. So France had been virtually bankrupted by victory. They had nothing. The Italians had some money, but they were very angry because they had been shabbily treated at Versailles. So they said, to heck with you. We're not giving you a lira. And then the British went to the Russians and said, boy, you owe us a lot of money for this. The Russians just laughed in their faces. Well, take it up with the Tsar. Where are the Soviets now? Communists don't owe you a dime, you capitalist pig, you know. So the British go back to the Americans and say, we have nothing. The whole war bankrupted us. Well, that's what you wanted. So the British said, well, let's make some kind of terms, easy payments of some kind. The Americans said, we'd be glad to do that. Well, what kind of interest do we want? 15%. 15%? I mean, we'll just be economic slaves of the United States. Well, you shouldn't have asked for all these loans. So that was all through the 1920s. Relationship between the United States and the British got really bad, seriously bad. All under the table, all hush-hush. But it got worse and worse because the British were not paying. They couldn't pay. And the Americans are saying, hey, we have our debts here to our own workers and so on. We need that money. It was bad. 1927, without even some of the British or American leaders realizing what was going on, they staged a very good conference. It was an arms conference to limit arms, and they realized that this horrendous event of World War I could never be repeated, and so let's have some arms reduction at least. And so there was this international meeting in London, and everything went well. All the countries are trying to figure out ways to get their weapons down, but not the British or the Americans. No, because they realized that America now, hey, we're on top. we're not going to relent in anything. We're not going to cut out a single rowboat out of our Navy. That's what they basically told. When the British heard that, they said,
let me say one quick thing.
Go right ahead,
all the years I've been listening and learning about the British Empire, we can go back to Genghis Khan. Take your choice. I don't know of any that was more ruthless or brutal than the British on the face of the planet. When you look at ancient geopolitics and bring it fast forward to current times, how do you feel about that?
Well, now they're getting their comeuppance.
Yes, they are.
That's how they got their empire, by being ruthless. And they didn't get their empire by negotiating. The people of India did not invite the British in to colonize the subcontinent.
No, just like Syria hasn't invited us into its country to bomb and strafe and kill. And the Iraqis want us out. And I say us, I'm not talking about real Americans. I'm talking about this government that runs this corporate states of America we call the U.S. of A. Go ahead.
Well, I think that here you've put your finger on it. This is part of what we need to learn. Whenever there are these international involvements, and these involvements take place because of ulterior motives that have nothing to do with the patriotic zeal of the people that are going out and fighting and dying, that's when you lead yourself to catastrophe, and that's where the British found themselves out. So by 1927, after this peace conference, which ended very badly, with virtually the Americans and the British saying, well, we'll see you on the high seas. I mean, it was that nasty. From that point on, 1927, it was realized in Canada, England, and the United States that war was inevitable. It was regarded as inevitable. And all these countries had plans for going to war within the next 10 years or so. The Canadians were the first ones. They realized exactly that Canada would be the battleground between Britain and the United States. So the Canadian Armed Forces, under a brilliant general whose name, believe it or not, was Buster Brown. I think Buster was his nickname.
Oh, too funny. That's funny.
Buster Brown.
For those of you who don't know, there were shoes. There was a company that made shoes called Buster Brown Shoes, and they were an American staple, kind of like Levi's jeans. You didn't have Buster Brown shoes, you weren't cool. Anyhow, that goes way back.
Well, that was his name, Buster Brown. That was his nickname, was Buster. I forgot the rest, but he was in charge of the Canadian Armed Forces. And the Canadian Armed Forces were not large, but they were terrific. They were very well provisioned. They had a lot of great experience, like it or not, from World War I. They were tough, but they were nowhere near as numerous as the Americans. And so Buster Brown himself and his colleagues were spies in the United States, and they went all over, especially the northern part of the United States, mapping out advanced routes. And so Buster Brown and his comrades figured out the first of these war plans. And the war plans were very specific more than just plans. He was able to actually have his troops exercising on the border. Virtually the entire Canadian constabulary plus, in other words, police plus military, were all along the border. And the plan was that the moment that the Canadians suspected that there would be a conflict, even before the conflict, if they suspected that there was going to be on the verge of a conflict, they were going to invade the United States. They were going to raid the United States. And the objective was to seize and hold a number of American strategic points, especially cities, to do as much damage as possible, and then to get the hell out of there before the Americans woke up to it. And then when they would withdraw behind the border, they would fight like the devil in time for the British to arrive in strength. And it would take the British only 30 to 45 days to amass, to get in about 3.5 million men to Canada. So the British had to hold, or the Canadians had to hold Halifax. They were going to go as far south as Minneapolis and trash as much of Minneapolis as possible, throw the Americans off. This was all has been documented incredibly well. This was all top secret stuff. These plans were in effect from about 1928, 29, all the way to the into early World War II, 1940, and when they were finally declassified in 1974. That recently,
Right.
that's when this information came out. There was a more recent article in the Washington Post, 2005, and I came across these documents, and I cross-checked them, and I was just blown away. So the Canadians were, they were primed and ready to go. They had a lot of spies, especially like in Spokane, Washington, and places like that, in Oregon.
All the way in Spokane. Well, that would have been coming down from BC, British Columbia, Vancouver.
Yeah.
The western end of the government of Canada. So this was a coast-to-coast thing you're talking about.
Absolutely. It was all along the border, and these were in the form of raids. And there's every reason to expect that they would have been very successful.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the British, it's also typically British. The British were totally in on this. They thought it was great. That's right. You Canadians hold out as long as you can, and we'll send 3.5 million of our men there, and we'll get them there in time. Turns out that the British never had any intention of sending a single man to Canada, ever.
Really?
Who
were they conning?
They wanted to sacrifice the Canadians. They wanted to sacrifice. They said, boy, it'd be great if the Canadians, the Americans get bogged down. Just tell the Canadians to fight and hold on as long as you can. They'll all be slaughtered. We'll lose Canada. Who cares? Canada didn't mean anything to them at all. It meant nothing. The British had a devious and a far more effective... these guys didn't run their empire because they were fools. They were great strategists.
No, that's an MI6 job if I've ever heard of one.
But it's so interesting that the British always, saying, yeah, we're for freedom and we'll take care of the Canadians and all that. They were willing to sacrifice the entire Canadian population, everything, Canada entirely. So let the Americans have Canada. Let them turn it into another state for all the British cared. What we will do is that the British said, we're going to send our fleet out to the Bahamas and our islands in the Atlantic, like the Virgin Islands and things like that, and then we're going to attack the Americans while they're shooting it out with the Canadians. Now, this was all serious stuff. These were not contingency plans. The Americans, they had an unbelievable, it was a truly shocking plan. It's called the Red Plan.
The Red Plan. Now, this is our plan. This is in the 30s. The 30s.
This is now in the 30s.
All right. Is this FDR or is this prior to FDR? Do you know?
Prior and during. FDR was all for it. He got Now, the thing about FDR, like all these people, they're politicians, number one. Their top allegiance, their only allegiance is to themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And they will ally with other groups if they know that this is the best thing for their political career. That's the way it is today. That's the way it was with FDR, with all of these people. They're a criminal class. Politicians are a criminal class. Well, anyway, this is now around 1930. The American plan included the establishment of 3 very large airfields along the just below the Canadian border. One of them was totally camouflaged. The other 2 were supposed to be just a cover as civilian airports. But
these airfields were built when? In the 30s?
Early 30s. They were built.
They were camouflaged.
It took a long time. These airfields were so huge that they authorized the construction of them in 1931, and they were still being worked on in 1936. Now, that's interesting.
Montana, yes. Wyoming, what are you talking about?
Yes, I can send you the map, and you can post that.
See what you're saying, this is, jump in here. Hey, you've read Major Jordan's diaries,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
Well, the airfield that the American transports landed at to refuel before flying north and then over the Bering Sea into Russia with our top-secret material, all during World War II, those airfields may have been the ones that you're talking about.
Well, I would say maybe not. These airfields were built in really bizarre, remote areas, like you say, Montana, North Dakota.
Well, that's where one of them was that Jordan was stationed at. I think it was Montana.
Well, maybe it was one. I'd have to go back and read Jordan's diary. But the airfields required literally hundreds of thousands of men to build these things, and this was in the depths of the Depression. U.S.
WPA?
government.
It's a government WPA project?
No, I don't believe it was. No, it was not a UPA. No, it was not a UPA. It was all Army personnel, armed forces personnel, because it was secret. You could not have civilian workers out there doing this. This was secret stuff. Well, here's the music.
This is fascinating.
It's incredible.
This was a big deal.
It's bigger than you imagine.
All right, let's hear some more from Frank right after this break as we continue on this Tuesday night. Glad to have you on board out there. We'll be right back. How many others are like this, hidden away in the mists of time? This is a big one. Go ahead.
Well, one of the more disturbing aspects of the American plan it's called Plan Red. Red was a euphemism for Canada and the British, and the blue was a reference to American forces. And it's interesting that the Americans at this time, to show you how serious this was, the American Army staged the largest maneuvers in its history before or since, the largest maneuvers in its history at the Canadian border, specifically for launching this invasion. The invasion's chief goal was to defeat what the Americans expected to be British forces there, and then to literally annex Canada. It's in the document. It's in Plan Red, the declassification. It was found, as I said, in 1974, after it had been quietly declassified, and it's stamped top secret. After declassification, you can read, anybody can go there and read these things out. It's in the National Archives. And the purpose of the American attack was, first of all, to annihilate the British, and then to incorporate Canada as a state, completely take away its sovereignty, make them states of the United States. The most disturbing aspect of this was the strategic bombing raids that were scheduled for Toronto and various Canadian cities along the border. They didn't just want to seize. Halifax was not to be bombed because the Americans wanted Halifax as a port city to operate against the British. But Toronto was to be made an example and be bombed with poison gas. And the man that was in charge of that was none other than General Douglas MacArthur. He wasn't a full-fledged general at that time. He was put in charge of the it was known then, of course, as the U.S. Army Air Force. It was not the Air Force. It was not an independent branch of the services. It was part of the Army.
Wild. Yeah,
and they had no compulsion about using poison gas. And in the document it says this was they were going to use poison gas on a large scale. The Americans were, and they used the word for humane purposes. The reason why is that if they attacked and killed a large number of Canadians by poison gas, this would cause them to surrender all the quicker, and in the long run, this would save human lives. This is the type of mentality that was at work, and how serious this was. The construction of the airfields was so huge, and the mobilization. Like I said, this was the largest Army mobilization in its entire history.
Let me say one other thing, Frank. Yeah. This is in the early 1930s, and I want all of you to keep in mind that when you think of World War II, which was in the early 1940s, you think of B-24 Liberator bombers, you think of B-17s. In the early 30s, we were still flying biplanes.
Well, yes and no.
It was a mixture. I know there was a transition, but we didn't have B-17s in 1932, 33.
We did not need them because we had the equivalent of light and medium bombers. There was one bomber that had a pretty sizable payload. It was the Martin bomber. It was a twin-engined aircraft monoplane, and we have to remember also that the Liberators, so-called B-24s and B-17s.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah. they liberated Europeans from their own lives and their own civilization. That's about all they did. But those aircraft were 4-engine aircraft that they needed to have extensive range because the targets were so far away. It was totally different with the Americans fighting the Canadians because they were only a few miles across the border. It was not difficult to reach Toronto, and the Martin bombers, which had a significant payload, would have been able to do the job. The Canadians had virtually no air force. They had certainly no interceptors. We would have completely overwhelmed them.
They had lumberjacks, right?
They had no way. But that's not to take away from the ground forces of the Canadians, who would have fought very diligently. Now, what's so amazing about all this? Well, the whole thing is amazing, I suppose. This war was scheduled to take place in 1937, between 1936 and 37. The reason why it was held off all these years is because the Depression was having an effect on every aspect of the American economy, and so things did not move as fast as they could. The British understood this, and what the British did is that they modernized their fleet in anticipation of crossing the Atlantic and fighting it out with the Americans, and the British would have done extremely well. The American fleet was at that time in no position to take on the British Navy. The British had plans to bombard Boston. They had their units scheduled to attack American cities up and down the East Coast and as far as the Gulf of Mexico. They wanted to go into the Gulf of Mexico, do some heavy shelling in order to set oil fields on fire.
For our listeners who may have joined us, the goal of this madness was, recap it for us. What were the British hoping to do?
The goal of this madness was two things from the British point of view. One, they were faced with the collapse, the economic collapse of their entire empire, because the Americans were relentless in demanding the payment of this $22 billion debt. By the early 1930s, the interest on that $22 billion debt had gone up so much that if the British had even attempted to make regular payments, they would have been reduced from a major power into a minor power, or they would have economically collapsed. It's so strange because the Americans, with the help of the British themselves, put the British in the same position that the Japanese later found themselves in the 1940s, because we imposed on the British an oil embargo for political reasons. And if that oil embargo would continue, the Japanese knew their entire society would collapse, would grind to a halt for lack of oil. Right. That's why they attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was the same thing. Go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. The Brits at the same time in the early 30s were looking over their shoulders at what in Germany?
They were not worried about Germany at all. They wanted to come to an accommodation with Germany, and they came to a wonderful accommodation with Germany that Hitler was only all too willing to go ahead, and that was a naval arms agreement. The British loved that because they figured that with the arrival of Germany, the British had better get their military act together. But Hitler said, no, what I will do is I will sign an agreement with you in which I will limit Germany's navy to only 1/3 of the British Navy. 1/3. That's nothing. Because Hitler said
that's a brilliant strategic move by Hitler, but it should have made the Brits ecstatic.
It did. Because now the British said, thank God, we now have all the ships. We're not going to worry about Hitler. We can all our ships to fight it out with the Americans, because we can't fight the German Navy and the American Navy at the same time. We'll probably win, but we'll lose a lot. But now the British said, and so the British signed that agreement in a heartbeat. Hitler didn't have to negotiate with them at all because they knew about that.
And let me do one other thing, Frank, please. Yeah. And for all, this is rhetorical, but for all of you out there, all around the world, what was Adolf Hitler doing in 1939 and 40? He was trying everything possible to make a peace deal, a real peace deal with Great Britain. He didn't want anything to do with invading Great Britain, conquering Britain, nothing. He was dropping peace leaflets on London at the beginning of the war and on several occasions. And there's much more to it, but you got to get this in mind. Hitler was not some madman who had delusions of conquering the world. On the contrary, nothing could be further from the truth. We just don't know that because our history has been so corrupted and perverted. Go ahead. Sorry.
The British were not worried about Hitler. Now, we're talking about the early 1930s. Now, that might seem only a few years from the late 1930s. Big difference. The early 1930s up to 1935, 1936, Britain and Germany had reached a wonderful accord. This gave Hitler now free hand to break the chains of Versailles. He could build his army up. The British said, that's fine, go ahead. You just make sure that you keep your navy small. Hitler said, no problem with that. So the British felt now we're free. But the British were very worried about Mussolini because Mussolini had also built up a navy, and he was...
Well, they had a big fleet, the Italians.
They had a huge fleet. And so that is why Britain came very close to war. Now, this is all in the same time period. Britain came really close to war with Italy, not Germany, in 1935 and 1936 because Mussolini was in Ethiopia and he was making a colony of Ethiopia. And the British wanted to use that as an excuse where they can stomp on Mussolini. They had to have nobody in Europe that would require any attention from their navy. All their attention had to be focused on America. So the big change was this. What happened here, things were getting really hot between the British Empire and the Americans and Canada. And there's no doubt that if things had been left the way they were, there would have been a conflict. There would have been a major conflict that would have isolated Germany and Italy. They would have been, the Italians and the Germans would have been out after the Soviets, would have forgotten all about England and everybody, or the French and everybody else. Didn't turn out that way, though. And the reason why was because Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt himself endorsed this plan, the Red Plan, as it was called, the invasion of Canada and this fight with the British. He was all for it. And one of the reasons why he was for it is he hated the British Empire. He thought that the empire was a horrific travesty on humanity, and the British Empire should be dissolved. He actually told that to Churchill's face a number of times. Churchill, by this time, and we're talking about the early 1930s, and this you will not hear or see anywhere, any biographies on Churchill, any big biographies. Churchill was violently anti-American. He was so anti-American that his wife, Clementine, told him that this is relatively early in his career, 1929, 1930. His wife, Clementine, told him, forget trying to become foreign minister because when it comes out of your strong anti-American statements, your career will be over with. You're not going to be able to make it.
Well, that's interesting because in 1929, Bernard Baruch took Winnie to Wall Street to watch the crash. All right, he bailed Churchill out twice. Churchill was bailed. Let me be more specific. Twice in his life, Churchill was headed to bankruptcy. Basically, he was bailed out once by Bernard Baruch, and I forget who did it. But international money owned Churchill's butt from the beginning.
Yeah, Churchill was in really bad financial shape. And it wasn't all his fault. Churchill had inherited an incredible debt, the equivalent today of about $70 million debt that was left by his father, Randolph. Randolph Churchill had run up a debt of about $70 million, the equivalent today of $70 million, with, of all people, the House of Rothschild. Now, that's not a place where you run up bad debts. And in England at that time, when Randolph died, and Randolph still had millions of dollars of his own, because he's just floating debt all over the place, Randolph Churchill left his son, Winston, several $1 million. And under British law at that time, and this would be like the late 19th century, the law at that time was that if your father has all these bad debts, and he dies and he leaves you a fortune, if you renounce those debts, the debtor, the one who owns the debt, can't go after you. You're not liable for that debt at all. However, if you accept 1 shilling of your father's inheritance, you have to assume the debt of your father. And Winston foolishly accepted his father's inheritance, and he became an economic slave of the House of Rothschild from that point on. So I feel kind of sorry for him in a way. There's no way he could get out.
He was a you could almost call him a tragic figure, a severe alcoholic.
Yes, he is
over a quart of whiskey a day minimum. He had a lot of emotional, psychological problems. He was mentally unwell.
Under that pressure.
He was mentally unwell. It just tore him apart. I'm not excusing him for his genocidal madness, but he was not mentally well. He would often just disrobe completely and walk around naked in front of men and women. He didn't care. He was nuts. We have a completely bizarre picture of him in reality, vis-a-vis what it was. We don't know. Go ahead.
It's a strange thing. The more you learn about history, villains sometimes have a tendency to turn into pathetic caricatures of themselves, and that, I think, was with Churchill.
Well said.
And, well, in any case, the war between the United States and the British Empire was heating up. It was only a matter of time. The British were going to wait to see what the Americans do. They were all ready to go now that Hitler had given them carte blanche to have their navy back. No threats from Germany. The British Navy was ready at a moment's notice to occupy Halifax because that was an important port. That would have been their move, and also to fortify themselves in the Bahamas for immediate strikes up and down the eastern seaboard. And they were spoiling for a fight with the American Navy because they knew they would win. I mean, the British Navy at that time, that was top-notch. We were not top-notch at that time. And the Americans were triggered, ready to go. The only thing that was stopping the Americans or holding them back was it was taking time to build these 3 huge airfields and to equip this immense army that they had on the border. And what happened in 1937 was this. In 1937, well, first of all, Roosevelt had been elected in 1934. 4 years later, 1937, with the help of a number of influential people, he found himself surrounded by people like Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, some very disreputable characters, and they told him, in effect, forget Britain. We're not going to have America wasted in fighting the British. Forget that debt. Forget your $22 billion and all the interest on it. We have to stop Hitler because he is our number one goal, and he has to be your number one goal because we made you president. And then that year, in October 1937, Roosevelt made an about-face. Before 1937, he wanted to kick butt with the British. 1937, he made a speech in Chicago, the opening of the Lakeshore Drive Bridge up there, the largest movable bridge in the world. Right. And he made this speech that shocked people around the world. It was called the Quarantine Speech. You can still look it up on Wikipedia for a watered-down version of it. And in this speech, it was a bellicose, a warlike speech. He said that out of the blue, for no reason, it would appear that totalitarian states, fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, needed to be taken down a notch. I mean, the military implications of what he's saying was something. He says, well, they should be subjected to economic sanctions. Well, economic sanctions, as everybody knows, that's the prelude to war. First you get the economic sanctions, and when they don't work, then you move in the tanks. And he got a lot of bad feedback from Americans on that. It's an interesting thing. There was a poll taken at that time after his speech. All the newspapers, except for the Chicago Tribune and the Hearst papers, but all the other newspapers thought it was great what FDR is saying. That's wonderful. All the movie tone newsreels and all that. Oh, it's wonderful. But the vast majority of the American people were appalled and said that there's no way. Why are you spoiling for a fight for no reason? There's no threat from Little Italy, and Germany is only the size of Texas. crisis, and why are you doing this? So he moderated himself. But from that point on, 1937, officially, that was they put an end to that. They put an end to any more difficulties, the beginnings of war between the United States and Canada and England. That did it. But the United States Army didn't go along with Roosevelt. And they thought this was ridiculous, and they maintained their forces and continued to work on their forces at the Canadian border until 1940. Can you believe that? Even after World War II was going on, until Roosevelt stepped in and said, well, I'm not allocating you any more funds for anything on the Canadian border. It's all going to fight in Europe. And that's how that changed. That's how that changed around. That fast, things changed around.
Yeah.
The war was supposed to start like in 1937 or 36, at least according to the American Chiefs of Staff. About late 36, early 37, but it was in that year, in 37, where it changed because Roosevelt's puppeteers told him, no, we're going to have war, but it's going to be against the people we want to make it to, and not the people that you're interested in. That's the whole story in a nutshell. It's amazing. It's an incredible
amazing
story.
It's interesting to hear about how international Zionist money had already determined that Hitler was going to be the big target. And they did that in 36, 37. They were already thinking this was...
Well, actually, in 1933... that's when they had the first economic boycott. There was in Madison
Well, that's
Square
when they
Garden.
Declared war on Germany.
It was an actual declaration of war.
Front
and they
page on the newspapers. Yeah.
Right, they actually spelled it out. They said, first we're going to have economic sanctions against them, and then with the help of our Gentile friends, we'll do whatever is necessary to take down this. And nothing had happened. No 6 million, nothing, no concentration camps, nothing. It was only just, Hitler wasn't even in power a couple of months, and they're already talking about taking them down, So, yeah, history is an illuminating and kind of a depressing thing to study. At least recent history, anyway.
When you think about it and look at it and study it as you have for so long, and you know much more than I do, things should never have gone the direction they went. Only abject evil caused these things to happen. It's my firm belief. It's evil.
Well, follow the money. It's almost always the money.
Always the money. Greed, evil, money. Same.
It was money. One of the reasons, for sure, for the beginning of World War II, how that even started, was both Italy and Germany, especially Germany, created economic systems that cut off those two countries from the international system of debts and gold and everything else. What Hitler did to solve and Mussolini did basically the same thing. What they did to solve their economic woes, and those countries, of course, were prostrate financially, just absolutely bankrupted by the war and the depression and everything. And overnight, they bounced back because no longer was the German mark or the Italian lira based on stock markets or gold or anything. It was based exclusively on the productivity of the Italian or the German worker. In other words, Hitler and Mussolini said, if you work hard, that's what's going to base the value of our currency. And, of course, the Italians and the Germans are very hard-working people, and in a short time, these countries bounced back. Well, that was very dangerous for the international creditors and so forth, because they figured, like, oh, my God, if all these other countries, they're basing their economies on the productivity of their own people, well, we're out of business. There's no need for a Federal Reserve System or anything anymore. And so then they had to shut them down. I think that was the chief motive. They say anti-Semitism and so on. Well, that might have played a role. They were worried about the spread of anti-Semitism. But I think the chief motive for the Allies getting involved in World War II was they could not tolerate the spread of an economic system that cut themselves off from their coils, as it were, of maintaining the kind of money system we have today, the kind of transnational economy that we have today.
Many have tried, and many have died.
Individually and whole nations.
Yeah.
Boy, and you can say anything you want, all the freedom of speech, everything, but the moment you touch their money, that's it. They'll kill you.